I would like to warmly welcome you to this Innovation in Disaster Management report launch event. I know more people will be joining a bit later, but before we get started, please feel free to use the chat box to introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and your location. And we look forward to an engaging discussion with our speakers and our audience today. As we are already on time, I think we can already get started with the program. Again, welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Innovation in Disaster Management report launch event. My name is Nara, and I'm the moderator for today's session. I work at OCHA UNDP Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI. For those of you who are not familiar with us, CBI is a joint program of the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, and the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, engaging the private sector before, during, and after the event disasters. This session is organized by CBI and the UNDP Istanbul International Center for Private Sector in Development, SDG AI Lab. We are very excited to have you to join us today for this event for the launch of the report on innovation in disaster management, leveraging technology to save more lives. We are hoping to facilitate an exchange on emerging frontier technologies and their practical applications for disaster management, as well as showcasing the power of business when its resources are used to improve disaster preparedness, response, and recovery through a collective framework. So on the screen, you see our agenda for today. We will begin with the opening remarks from Ms. Florian Rieseneri, Deputy Program Coordinator at CBI, and Ms. Gökhan Dimener, who is the UNDP ICPSD Technical Specialist. We will soon turn it over to Ms. Dina Akobekova, UNDP ICPSD Partnerships Analyst. She will provide an overview of the report and its key findings. Dina, if you can go over to the agenda slide. But we will then hear from Ms. Glenn Craig, the chairperson of the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council. He will share the insights into the real-world implementation of the blockchain-powered cash transfer program in Vanuatu. Then we will be running a live Q&A, a discussion. So throughout this session, if you have any questions or comments to our speakers, please type them in the QA box on your screen. We will or raise your hands during the session. Finally, before we conclude this event, we will make sure that there is time for a group photo. Now, without further ado, I'm glad to welcome Ms. Florian Rieseneri, Deputy Program Coordinator, and Ms. Gökhan Dimener, who is the UNDP ICPSD Technical Specialist, for their opening remarks. We will start with Riza and then over to Gökhan. Riza, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Nara. Hello, everybody. Thank you for being here. It's great to see the number of people, many familiar faces I can see in the chat, dialing from different parts of the world to join us for this webinar on innovations and technology and disaster management. I would like to assume that you are here because you're interested not just about the report that Nara mentioned, but more importantly, I would like to think that you're also here for the stories, the real lived experience that you will hear from our amazing partners, especially from the local private sector, on how they were able to use innovation and technology to keep their communities safer and more resilient. Recently, I was reading this report called the Trust Barometer. Some of you might have heard about this. This is published, or an annual report published by the global communication firm Edelman. And in this report, they said that businesses are the most trusted to integrate innovations into society. And for the private sector, it makes business sense for companies to help and work with governments, with humanitarian and development agencies, and even with their industry competitors, with other companies too, especially when it comes to applying innovation and technology in how we collectively do disaster management. And we know that when disasters happen, one of the early responders oftentimes is the business community. So the private sector, with its resources and really unparalleled innovative capabilities, can contribute not just as a source of funding, but as a driver of fresh ideas and solutions. And this is what we at the Connecting Business Initiative, or CBI, believe in. We are a joint initiative launched by the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP, and the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, or OCHA, to strengthen the engagement of the private sector in humanitarian action and disaster resilience, leveraging the private sector's expertise, resources, and networks to support the most affected communities. During the response to the major earthquakes that devastated Turkey and Syria last year, the CBI member network in Mexico, SENACED, and their partners deployed a live detector search and rescue equipment that was critically needed at that time. When Category 5 Cyclone Harold hit Vanuatu in 2020, it was the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, or VBRC, under the leadership of Glenn Craig, who is here with us today, that stepped up to lead the relief efforts in coordination with the government. You'll hear more from him in a short while. And so these are just some of the stories that you will be finding in this report. And I would like to thank our colleagues, Gokhan, Adina, and others at the SDG AI Lab. A big shout out to as well to Jonas, I see in the chat, for allowing us this opportunity to bring this report to life. I hope you're all as excited as I am to learn more about the report and to listen to the amazing speakers we have today. Thanks, everybody, and I look forward to an amazing session today. Over to you, Nara.
Thank you, Risa. So now over to Gokhan. Gokhan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And also I would like to thank my colleagues for the introductions and the welcoming remarks. And I would like to welcome you to our Innovations in Disaster Management report launch event. We thank each of you for dedicating your time and being with us today to celebrate this. And we all know that we are living in a more dangerous world. In our time, disasters are increasing in both frequency and strength, and our quest is finding innovation solutions, and this has been more critical. Our report stands at the forefront of this mission. It proposes a vision where technology is not just an enabler, but also a transformative change agent in disaster management. Frontier technologies, once they were considered science fiction, now they are our common and powerful allies in this fight. And in our daily life, we are frequently using them, and we are suggesting that why shouldn't we use them also for fighting with the disasters? For instance, 3D printing, it was initially an industrial technology used in industrial spaces, now proposes immediate relief in crisis zones. It allows fabricating shelters and essential tools in the urgencies, and how it can make difference in those critical hours. We all remember from COVID times that some of the ER room equipments were printed with 3D printers. And artificial intelligence, another technology, another source of hope. It is capacity, is vast in terms of analyzing, predicting disasters, and also finding ways to cope with them. This is not just about mitigating the damage, but also about saving lives and giving the communities the necessary time to prepare and evacuate. And we all know these promises, but we should take these promises with a pinch of salt. And there are more technologies, for instance, AI and VR systems allow us immersive training environments for first responders, Blockchain technology ensures the integrity of aid distribution, and the Internet of Things can connect a myriad of devices and harmonize them and allow us to respond effectively to the disasters. Again, they all come with some limitations and some warnings. You may find all these in the report, and the private sector, it is standing at the core of these advancements. The private sector is driving innovations and ensuring these technologies not reach to the market, but they are also adapted into the disaster contexts. And our report actually elaborates on these synergies, and we illustrated, together with our partner CBI, how public-private partnerships actually can elevate our response capacities to new levels. We will also hear about CBI networks. They are presenting cases all around the world, from Mexico to Philippines to Vanuatu, and they show us actually what's possible when the private sector aligns its resources and its ingenuity with the public good. And we will see that the solutions are both innovative and inclusive in the engagement of the private sector. While we are charting this good picture, we also need to be aware of the obstacles. The digital divide threatens, and it's a widening gap. So we need to understand that there is a limitation about who can leverage these technologies and who will remain at their mercy. And to be able to use these technologies, also we need the talented people and the skilled people to deploy them, and this is also distributed unevenly. And to address all these and to size all of these opportunities, we are actually proposing actionable strategies. We advocate for a standardized framework to assess the digital readiness maturity of communities and organizations. And this will create a baseline that we can advance on them. And we are also calling for a democratization of these technologies. We need to cultivate an ecosystem where knowledge flows freely, and training and capacity building initiatives are vital, especially for equipping local responders and communities with the necessary skills. Today, also, we are celebrating our fruitful collaboration with CBI, especially in understanding the practical applications of these emerging technologies through CBI networks. And as I would like to mention that the partnership and this report is not an end to these activities, but beginning of an ambitious journey. And we would like to forge a new paradigm today in disaster management. And we would like to underline again, resilience is not just hoped, but it is actively built by the communities. I thank you again for your attention and your dedication and your willingness to be part of this effort. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Gökhan. Thank you again, Riza. It's really a pleasure to hear from you. Colleagues, now we'd like to move directly into the substance of our session today, and we will start with a presentation on an overview of the report and the key findings. I'm very pleased that we have with us on the line Dina Akobekova. She is the UNDP ICPSD Partnerships Analyst. The floor is yours, Dina.
Thank you so much, colleagues. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'll be briefly summarizing the report to you. Hopefully, I'm not going to spoil the contents and just spark your interest. So let me first start on what's the purpose of this report. So we try to explore the use of technologies in disaster management, and we try to understand what's their impact on preparedness, response, recovery, and resilience, but also we were trying to understand and explore the ethical considerations, because there are quite many issues related to data privacy, bias in AI, also inclusion of vulnerable groups in discussions. But then, of course, it was very important for us to integrate the private sector dimension on how we can engage it more effectively, and echoing Riza on how we can be partners with the private sector in disaster risk reduction. And then this report, it's a more or less hands-on practical guide for disaster professionals and private sector on how they can use digital technologies for resilience. So this report provides very clear guidance. It provides real-world cases, and also the methodology on the maturity assessment and how to proceed with the technology selection. So let's get started then. So first, I would like to briefly introduce our partnership with the Connecting Business Initiative. So SDG AI Lab have been partnering with the Connecting Business Initiatives for at least 3 years now. And our main objective was to explore and experiment with the use of technologies in disaster context. So as a part of this partnership, we have been working on this report. And then also we have been focusing on 2 technologies, namely geographic information systems, machine learning and natural language processing. So for that, we have prepared 2 briefs covering each technology, because those ones are one of the most promising technologies in disaster management. And then we also developed 2 prototypes, one of them using GIS and another one using natural language processing. So with GIS, we mapped small and medium enterprises in one of the Philippine provinces, and we explored the risk that they face when it comes to natural hazards. And then for NLP prototype, we've been exploring the engagement of the private sector from their corporate social responsibility report in disaster context. So report, as I mentioned, it's very hands-on. So we tried also to keep it as brief as possible, but it's still very comprehensive. So first, we provide the landscape analysis. So we really provide in-depth review of available technologies and when and how they can be used with the real-world examples. And then secondly, we also cover the risk and vulnerable groups, because it's very important to be practical in that sense that we understand the limitations and considerations that we need to be mindful of, would it be data or ethical issues. But also we need to make sure that we keep in mind underrepresented groups, specifically women, and we make this process as inclusive as possible. And then third one is mapping technologies to private sector. So the focus of this report is also the engagement of the private sector. So we'll be using the case of CBI network members, and we'll be exploring how they can benefit from these technologies and how they can use them. And also, of course, there will be some examples. And then lastly, we'll be providing some reflections and some humble recommendations on how we can advance technologies in disaster context. So first, of course, you can ask what technologies did we cover in this report. I think in this context, it's very hard to stay updated because it's changing every day. For instance, with the ChatGPT, if you speak about ChatGPT 2 years ago, people think you're crazy. So unless like you're working in this specific field, but that's something that we have to be mindful of. So for this report, we decided to go with the technologies which are pretty mature and also which are proved to be successful in disaster context. So it means that there are use cases and there are real world examples of these technologies being used. But also another thing is that we try to identify technologies which can be combined together and that they can bring the best results possible. But also we try to ensure the diversity. So for instance, we cover not only technologies working with the text data, but also with images and others. So there is a good variety of technologies in that sense. So I don't want to explain each of these technologies, but very briefly, I would like to give some examples. For instance, artificial intelligence and machine learning, we can use it to predict natural disasters, and we can classify and analyze information so we can really see the impact of the disasters. So I would say that artificial intelligence has one of the broadest applications in disaster context. Then, of course, geographic information systems. It's also very commonly used even within the UNDP context. So it's used often to map affected areas, but also it can help us to understand the destruction level. For instance, in Turkey, they have been using geographic information system to identify dump site after the earthquake. Then, for instance, blockchain, I don't want to spoil, but it used a lot in the secure information transfer. Our colleague from Vanuatu will be covering this. But then, of course, social media, it's not that apparent, but it can be very helpful to sharing the information, but also it's a great source of information itself. And then there is a 3D printing, as Gökhan has mentioned. It has been mainstream nowadays, so it used quite a bit to support population in the emergencies where they don't have access to necessary items. So now I give the brief overview of technologies that we have covered, but then we try to also link it on how they can exactly be used in the disaster management. Because one thing is to be passionate and be very eager to learn about technologies, but another thing is to understand on how you can use them and when you can use them, right? So first, we start with the disaster assessment and prediction and early warning system. So this is when we're trying to understand when should we expect and what should we expect, right? More or less. And for this, artificial intelligence and machine learning are very helpful because with their help, we can predict, for instance, floods. We had the great webinar last year from Bosnia and Herzegovina colleagues where they presented how they use AI modeling for flood prediction, and it was also used by the local governments. Then event simulation, so it helps us to prepare better ourselves to the cases of emergencies. And the technologies that are most prominent in this case are virtual reality. So for instance, in Philippines, they have been using it in the for the simulation events, so people could train themselves, but it also has been used in Japanese schools. So students can experience an earthquake or tsunami, and they could understand what should they expect and how they should act on it. Then disaster detection. Of course, we can also need to understand if there is a specific event happening. Say if this is happening in the remote area, we can benefit from satellite imagery and other things. So we can really understand which areas are affected and how we can support the affected populations. Then search and rescue, of course, that's a very important component in disaster management and disaster response. So for that, we often use drone technologies, so we can identify the areas where the missing people are located or others. For instance, in Turkey, during the earthquake, many people were posting in Twitter their actual locations, and people were able to find them and help them. So that's one of the not very obvious uses of technologies, but that's something that really helped many people in Turkey. Then damage and loss assessment. Of course, when we start recovery activities, it's important to understand how many buildings were affected, how much of population needs assistance, right? So for this, we often use geographic information system, so we can quickly assess which buildings were damaged. For instance, in Beirut, after the explosion, UN and its partners were able to assess it very quickly and contribute to the recovery. Then disaster relief, logistics, and resource allocation. So this is also quite important, so we can allocate our aid very effectively. So for this, we often use blockchain technologies, so we can say do cash transfer and we can monitor the aid flows. But then another thing is, of course, dashboards. So with the help of dashboards, we can have all information in one place and we can really coordinate our activities. Then emergency communication. That's one of the critical things, is that we provide accurate and up-to-date information to the population. So, of course, the most important technologies would be here, like 3G, 4G, 5G, but also social media, for instance, or chatbots. So during the COVID time, many people didn't have access to government services, and they used chatbots where they could learn information. For instance, in Georgia, during COVID times, small and medium enterprises, they didn't have access to government services. So UNDP Georgia, they established the chatbot where they provided all the necessary information to people so they wouldn't have to leave their houses. And then lastly, situation awareness and actionable information gathering. So this would help us to understand what's going on the ground, so we're not really reactive, but we can also plan what we're going to do. So with this one, we do use GIS, crowdsourcing and dashboards, so we can really understand what's going on the ground. So this is just a very brief overview on how we can use technologies in the specific activities of disaster management. But then, of course, it's all very interesting, it's very innovative, but at the end of the day, we need to be aware of the possible challenges and limitations that we might have. So one, of course, it's a technical limitation itself, it's a, say, infrastructure. Because in some countries, say in developing countries, the ones which are affected the most by the nature of disasters, they might have limited access to internet. And most of these technologies, they require a strong internet connection or access to cloud services. But then there's another thing is knowledge and skills. You might not have necessary tech talents in the field who need to support this, because most of these projects, they require not only one person, but a team of professionals. So that might be quite challenging. Then, of course, data requirements. All these technologies, specifically artificial intelligence and machine learning, they are very data intensive. So they require lots of data, and it should be very high quality data, right? So that's something that also many organizations can struggle with. But then apart from the quality of data, there are other issues related to privacy and responsible use. For instance, say when we use drone imagery, how do we ensure that we respect people's privacy? And for instance, after this information is gathered, how do we handle it responsibly? So all rights and privacy of people involved is respected. Then, of course, there are some practical considerations which might be not very obvious, but we really need to think about this: cost and benefits, and also time frame. Because some of these technologies, they can be pretty straightforward. For instance, developing a chatbot, right? But then there are some technologies which are much more sophisticated. And for instance, if we start bringing the expensive equipment and sophisticated software, but then, for instance, there is no internet, or the equipment can be easily damaged, there is no really use of these innovations. So those are things that we really need to consider before going into the field and experiment with the digital technologies. But then, unfortunately, our challenges don't stop with these possible technical issues, because there are many more things that we need to consider. So for us, it was very important to ensure that we're not leaving anyone behind in this process, and we really make this as inclusive as possible. So we ensure that everyone benefits from the technologies. So the first one, of course, it's a digital divide. As I mentioned before, many developing countries have limited access to internet and technologies. And nowadays, I think it's a very big and serious issue. It also relates to the lack of talents often in these countries. Then, of course, government regulations. Because in some countries, especially developed countries, for instance, in the European Union, Japan and other countries, there are regulations related to privacy, for instance, GDPR, right? So this way we can really ensure how the data of EU citizens and residents is used responsibly, and that people who live there, they understand how their data is protected. But in developing countries, that might be not the case, and the governments, they need to step in. But at the same time, there should be a balance, because as I mentioned, when it comes to the use of drones, how do we ensure that we respect people's privacy, but at the same time, we can effectively use these technologies? Or for instance, with the social media, because often people get criticized for using social media as a data source, because it's also might be considered as a violation of privacy, but also other things. But at the same time, it's open source, it's a great source of data. So there are some considerations we need to consider when it comes to government regulations. Then one of the serious issues is AI bias. That's something that has not been discussed enough, but I think thanks to ChatGPT, it's becoming much more obvious that there are quite many biases that we need to be aware of. So the first one, of course, is societal bias. So we need to understand, for instance, how are the different groups of society are represented. Would it be urban or rural? For instance, if we say collect the data only from social media users based in capital city, that would be one picture. But then if we include people from rural areas and maybe more vulnerable populations, that would be giving us another analysis, right? So it's very important to make sure that we're very cautious of these biases. But then spatial bias is the same. It's, for instance, we have the model trained for the specific location, and then we're trying to adopt it for another location. Of course, we can use it as a base, but we cannot rely on this specific model and make sure that it's going to work in this new location, right? For instance, we have a project in Guatemala on the illegal dump sites detection, and we have been working with the colleagues in Italy. And when we tried to experiment with their model in Guatemala, it didn't show very good results, so we had to adopt it. So that's something that needs to be in consideration, but also people who implement it, they need to take their time and adopt it so they can ensure best results. Then gender bias, gender dimension. This is kind of overarching because we need to think how women are engaged in the process of developing digital solutions, because that's often the case that tech companies are located in developed countries, but then also women are underrepresented in STEM. So the developers team might be not as diverse as we want. But then when it comes to the end user, the situation can be also quite room because women might not have access to technologies. They might not be smartphone users, or maybe maybe they are not educated to use these technologies. So there are quite many things we need to consider. But then, of course, the biggest question would be on how do we address these challenges. So please don't be discouraged. There are many ways on how we can really address this. Of course, there is a need for capacity building. So we need to raise tech talents in developing countries and ensure that they can adapt their knowledge to disaster context. But then there's another thing when it comes to infrastructure. Of course, that's one of the biggest challenges of our generation, that we need to ensure that everyone has adequate access, say, to internet or telecommunications. But then, of course, data regulations, that's something that I think is discussed quite widely nowadays, but I think that's something that should be speed up so we can have more or less some standards and regulations in place. And once the disaster happens, we can respond in a proper manner. And then, of course, with the developers teams, we need to ensure that the women are engaged, or other people are engaged. So we are working with the diverse groups of developers. But at the same time, we also need to be mindful of who are our end users, and that they are also diverse and they're covering all the groups of the population. So then, of course, I would like to discuss on how we can engage private sector in the disaster risk reduction and resilience activities. So advancing technologies in disaster management requires a multi-stakeholder approach. As you can imagine, this is a very complex context, and it brings together, say, UN, international organizations, non-profits, and others. So while public sector can provide us guidance, funding, but also overall coordination, and academia can help us with the research, capacity building, and others, private sector is capable of providing us innovations, know-how, existing solutions, access to data, and they might have really good outreach to the population, and they can help to increase local ownership. So there are quite many things that we can get support from the private sector. But then it's also important to understand how the private sector can benefit from this engagement. So for them, it's increased resilience. So they might be sure that their businesses is not going to fall down just because of the, say, natural disaster, right? So they're resilient. Then, of course, it's increased skills that they can train their staff, but also they can train local population. Then spillover effect is, of course, that we have much more impact. So it will be going from the single company. And then, of course, from corporate social responsibility, it's a very good activity, but it also contributes to the advancement of the SDGs by the specific company. And then there is an opportunity to explore new partnerships. So as I mentioned, this is a very practical report. So we're trying to also provide some guidance to teams which are interested in adopting digital technologies, but also this has been prepared for CBI networks on how they can use digital technologies in their work. So of course, the most important thing is that we need to understand the needs, what's in the ground, and what we can do. And then after that, we need to understand what's available, what technologies are available. And then we're trying to understand if there is a gap. And also we need to understand on how we can fill this gap and what we have. Do we have enough data? Do we have funding? Do we have partners for that? And only after that we can proceed with the digital solutions development. But then if it's not good enough, we need to reconsider it again and go back. But then if everything is fine, we can proceed and say develop the fully fledged solution. But then, of course, throughout the whole implementation process and running of the solution, we need to assess it continuously and make sure that we improve it along the way. So here you can see just some initial mapping we did for CBI networks. So we identified the natural hazards the countries are prone to, and also the solutions that might be quite helpful for them. For instance, Turkey is affected by the earthquakes, and social media and communication networks can be very helpful. And from the examples I provided, you can also see that. Then we also did maturity analysis of CBI networks, and we tried to understand the country context, but also the overall capacities of the network. And for instance, in Philippines, the network is quite advanced and they're very mature. So PDRF, so they have been working with these different stakeholders on GIS-based management platform. So they were able to engage private sector into the effective response. In Mexico, the network has a medium level of maturity, and they have built the great platform which encourages collaboration between the private sector and the public sector. Then, of course, we couldn't stop just with publishing report. We used the findings of the report to develop a frontier technology radar for disaster risk reduction. So it can be understood as a one-stop shop for all available digital solutions in disaster context. So we gathered over 100 cases from UN and beyond, and user can see different use cases according to their maturity and also when they can be used. And also it's possible to filter by the disaster or filter by technology. This has been implemented, of course, under our partnership with Connecting Business Initiative and by the colleagues from UNDP DRT team. So lastly, here recommendations we have identified. Of course, it's very important to conduct digital maturity assessment of the entity which is willing to implement the digital solution in the disaster context. Then it's very important, of course, to ensure that there is sufficient knowledge and skills. Then it's very beneficial to engage communities-based networks, as in the case of Connecting Business Initiative. Then we need to have enough resources, funding, and data for the digital response. And then there's, of course, a need to continuously engage private sector while ensuring that there is a clear benefits from them. And then, of course, we need to ensure that we outreach more on the use of technologies and, of course, encourage people to use them more. So thank you so much. This is a just very brief overview of what we did. So here is our report. It published. So feel free to scan the QR code and you go to Connecting Business Initiative website. So please download it and let us know if you have any questions. I will be also sharing the report in the chat box. Thank you so much. And I'll be giving floor to back to Nara. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina, for the very detailed and informative presentation. Colleagues, I just want to remind you, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box or the chat box so that later we can go right into addressing any questions that you may have. Next, I'd like to welcome Mr. Glenn Craig, the chairperson of the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council, or VBRC, a CBI member network in Vanuatu, who will be sharing with us the on-the-ground example of how the local business networks apply the unblocked cash solution to provide aid response to communities affected by a humanitarian disaster, its impacts and the lessons learned. Mr. Glenn, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and hi colleagues, and it's so good to see so many of you online. I'm Glenn, I'm the chairperson of the Vanuatu Business Resilience Council. For those of you who don't know our organisation, the VBRC was formed in 2017 as a direct result of the Connecting Business Initiative, who you've heard from Riza about our purpose and fundamental reason for being, which is to support the government and the communities we operate in times of crisis. So the VBRC is the recognised focal point for the private sector in Vanuatu on anything to do with humanitarian response and disaster, and also to do with climate change. Since the two are most inextricably linked, we represent both. So we're the official focal point. The VBRC is a standalone NGO, and we're run by a team of volunteers, and we're fairly active in the community, as most of you would know. I'll run through a little bit about Vanuatu. Our most, in the humanitarian space, we're known as the most at-risk country to natural disaster due to geographic disposition, smaller population base, and also, a relatively new country and our ability to respond. The country is beautiful. I've lived here for 20 years myself. We've got 300,000 people in Vanuatu, spread across 83 different islands. We're 3 hours from Australia, 3 hours from New Zealand by flight, and we're about an hour and a half from Fiji. So we're right in amongst those Pacific Island countries. We've got volcanoes, we've got beaches, rivers, coconut trees, you imagine it, and a lot of breaking reefs. So we're spread across, we're quite diverse, we're spread fairly close to the Solomon Islands, and we go right down south, and there's actually a temperature drop that you notice from one end of the island to the other. So because of it's not all paradise, we do have the issue obviously with natural disasters. Due to warming climates, we're getting more frequency of hurricanes, cyclones. We have 3 active volcanoes in Vanuatu. So with those active volcanoes, we obviously get things like ash falls. We had a full island evacuation with 11,000 people evacuated less than 6 years ago. So we do have issues with that as well, and obviously around crops and the suffocation of them. And we have an issue with warming sea levels, which affects our livelihoods through the sea. So that's where we are. In terms of, I'll just put you through to the next slide. In terms of the challenge that we had, and we're here to talk about the Unblocked Cash project, we were the first country in the world to respond to a natural disaster. We had TC Herald that came through while we're under COVID pandemic lockdown. So the country was under a full lockdown. 3 months later, or 2 months later, we had a massive cyclone come through, which devastated the whole middle swath of the archipelago. It was terrible there, and the realization was that no one was coming to our rescue. We couldn't just bring in responders like we normally do because we were under pandemic lockdown. We were the last country in the world to actually have COVID, or the second to last country to have COVID enter our borders in Vanuatu. So it was a really strict lockdown, so no one could just fly in, and so we had to respond ourselves. So because of that, we looked at what we needed to do to help respond, and the VBRC played a critical role in that. We were the first group to get on the ground to check on what the condition of the airports was, what were the telecommunications doing. We coordinated with our maritime sector and the domestic shipping fleets. What was the state of them? So the VBRC played a really, really active role in that response. Also, we'd played a big role in preparing the government for COVID-19. We wrote all the standard operating procedures for the government departments. We ran business continuity training. So the VBRC is a very active organisation in the community that we operate in. So we decided that there was a need for innovation, and we were looking around for different tools to help respond because of that geographical spread that we have. So introducing Unblock Cash, that name was penned by Sandra Hart, who was, she's a well-known responder, expert in blockchain, and she was the country manager for Oxfam at the time. And she approached us with this concept around using blockchain technology. So Oxfam had the tools and the resources to identify potential beneficiaries. The VBRC didn't, but what the VBRC had was it had the private sector that gave it the ability to mobilize and support the response network and identify those vendors that could in the communities that would be most of use to help support the beneficiaries. So it really was a match made in heaven. We had a really committed NGO. We had the VBRC that was relatively well organized. And we had some very supportive donor partners, with the first one being the New Zealand government that came on board, and then the Australian government came on board at the same time. And so they had a lot of confidence in the system to run this initial pilot. So at the heart of what we did was the beneficiaries were given tap and pay cards. So they had a chip embedded in them, and then the vendors were given dumbed down mobile phones, very simple mobile phones. They were handed out, and what would happen is that the beneficiary would simply tap their card against the mobile phone for a cash transfer to take place. So the money was put on the cards by the management team that had identified the beneficiaries. The cards were handed out into the communities, and then they could use that to go and buy the products and services. And what we found is it gave people their dignity back. People could buy what they needed to help respond. So whether it was because of the COVID issue where they had lost incomes and there was a lack of livelihoods, or it was in response to the actual cyclone where people needed to buy building materials or they'd lost clothing. Everyone had different requirements. And what we found is we gave people the cash. So everyone knows the benefits of cash transfer. We were just delivering it slightly different using digital technology. We thought it was very innovative, and it turns out it was. And it gave people the ability to just buy what they want when they needed it. And that was hugely empowering to watching the communities and the individuals. One of the other benefits, of course, is that the money was flowing back through the communities. It was a truly localized led response. It helped us streamline the whole delivery process. So that was a significant factor when we were putting this together. So it was very, very economic to get humanitarian aid into the hands of those that needed it in a timely manner. And then when it was with the vendors themselves receiving immediate cash coming back from the beneficiaries, it really empowered those people in the business community. And these, we're talking MSMEs and SMEs. The funds flowing through the communities allowed workers to stay and be employed. And of course, COVID-19, a lot of workers have been laid off, but the funds flowing into those businesses allowed those businesses to keep staff on. Those staff obviously took money back home to their families, enabled them to buy food, all the things that they needed, pay for school fees, transport. So it really was an all-round approach to the whole problem. It wasn't just limited to the traditional approach where aid items are flown in from overseas, then distributed by boat to the affected islands. So it was a very unique concept at the time. In terms of implementing the program, VBRC was responsible for the vendor engagement. So we were the ones that went through and checked that the vendors were suitable and capable of using the technology. As I said, it was a community-centric approach. We chose small vendors over large vendors. We really wanted the money to flow back at a grassroots, so we didn't give it to the larger chain store types of organizations or the larger wholesalers. And we gave, it was right through to the shops, through to the transporters. So if you're on a small remote island off the island of Santo and you lived on the island of Malo, you could get on a banana boat transport and you could pay the boat operator, the boat driver, with your Unblock Cash card. You could tap it, he would have a phone, and so you could get from home to the shop and return again, or use an Unblock Cash. It was very significant. We used a service provider out of Australia called Sempo. So Sempo are well versed in blockchain technology for humanitarian response. Tried, tested, everything's been audited through their system, and it gave us a dashboard that we could see what the money was being spent on. And that was really important for us. And I'll cover that off later on. But it gave us full visibility, which was important for transparency for the donor partners, for the Vanuatu government, and also for Oxfam and for us to make sure that the funds were being spent appropriately and where they should be. It was very, very simple to calculate the cost of delivery of the funds in the program. I'll take you through to the next slide. In terms of the benefits and impacts, speed was a big one, I have to say. Being able to get funding quickly to the communities, see it working, and immediately put a call out to our donors to say, team, this is working. Can you provide us with more funding so we can give people more, our currency's Vatu, we can give them more Vatu, more money on their card. So that was a big thing. Security and transparency. Blockchain technology, as we know, is just the creme de la creme of technology in terms of traceability and security. So it enhanced the transparency and gave our donor partners absolute confidence that the funds were being spent as they should. The stimulation in the local economies, I'll go through some numbers with you shortly, but certainly that was a big factor, and the dignity of choice, as I've already mentioned. In total for this response, we had 352 vendors signed up. So that was 352 transport operators, people with smaller shops. We did have a couple of larger hardware vendors in those areas where that was the choice that was there. The majority of the vendors were grocery stores. They were 43%. We had market vendors. So these are people in our local fruit, fresh produce markets. We call them the mamas that are there. They'd got together. They were 24% of our vendors that we had signed up. And then we had hardware stores with 14%. And then we had other sectors like energy, agriculture, bakery, people who go and buy their seeds. And we had also pharmacies, just so people could buy medicine if they needed it. In terms of beneficiaries, we had over 4,000 beneficiaries. These are the people with individual cards. That resulted in over 20,000 people directly impacted from it in this one, and the distribution by gender, we had 53% were female and 40% were male. In total, we distributed just over 265 million Vatu. So that in US dollars was around 2.4 million US dollars, and the majority of that was injected directly into the economy. In terms of the spending patterns, that was really interesting. So in total, there were 125,000 transactions that were made on the network. It was incredible. It handled full-scale large rollout in a small country. So we had confidence it would work if we distribute it to other islands. But 46% of people bought long life, non-perishable food items. In terms of sanitation and hygiene, that accounted for 14%. Fresh produce was 14%. And 10% was hardware. The smaller categories were things like drinks, medicine, and health and water. And what we call taboo restricted items, it was non-existent. It didn't even reach a percentage where people were buying things they shouldn't have been buying, like tobacco products or alcohol. It just really didn't happen. And that was very surprising. So when the beneficiaries got the cards, they realized that responsibility came with it. So that was pleasing to see. Total number of partners in terms of NGOs and donor partners and organizations and government, we had 19 involved in the project. There were 90 staff and volunteers in the project, 90, and we had 44 registration sites for the beneficiaries. And we had vendor training sites that the VBRC ran to train the vendors. We had 21 of those. And we had a 24/7 helpline that vendors could call if they had an issue. And we received just over 1,300 phone calls during the 6-month life of the project. So we thought the training really benefited and we got less calls than what we thought we might. I'll take you through to the next slide. The power of the partnership, it was viewed as a huge success in terms of what could be done in collaboration with the Vanuatu government in terms of private sector responding with the NGOs. In Vanuatu, generally, the funding goes to the NGOs, like in most of the Pacific, when there's a disaster response, it goes to the NGOs. This was a chance for the private sector to show that they could really come in and deliver on this. So that by our local business engagement and the collaboration, we viewed it as a huge success. and innovation used with the local knowledge. That was massive. So it highlighted how we could use technology and pair it with the local knowledge and resources that we had, knowing what would work and won't work, what wouldn't work on the ground, using our local and traditional knowledge, knowing where the beneficiaries were, the transport was needed. We identified a lot that international responders wouldn't have, and we took a great deal of pride in that. And then we realized that it could ideally be a blueprint for the future, and that was proven correct. Where a year later, after this, where Oxfam won a technology innovation prize for this project, and they won $1 million grant to actually take this out further across the region. So it was recognized globally how successful it was. Conclusion, just to wrap up here, we think the blockchain technology and using digital technology and things that you will see in the report that's been released show how it can really advance humanitarian aid. We're a small country in Vanuatu, we're tiny, and it's just so hard to deliver things using a manual basis and deliver services and products to the people. The digital technology really is a lifesaver. We're going to see new innovations come through with blockchain in areas like parametric insurance. We've proven that it can be done with the growth of the mobile phone technology in developing countries. Those services that can be delivered there means that we're going to be more proactive in terms of the response to humanitarian aid delivery. And we think that if we can do it in Vanuatu, where we are so at risk, yet we are still developing and a little bit behind the rest of the developed world, we think if it can work here, then it's only up for the rest of the world using these tools and this technology. So we really hope that it gets picked up on and taken further. So that's it from me in our language. Thank you, Tomas. And I really appreciate you taking the time to be here this evening and listen to this.
Thank you very much, Glenn, for sharing your invaluable experience and the perspective with us. If you want to learn more about the details of the program, please visit CBI website and read this report on the unblocked cash experience in Vanuatu. I also put the link in the chat box. And now I think we're in the Q&A session. I see around 60 people on the line with us today. And we've had this presentation now from Dina, from Glenn, and we'd really like to turn it over to hear from you and respond to your questions. Again, if you have any questions or comments, please use the Q&A box or the chat box, or even raise your hand. We will put your mic and the camera on. And if possible, please indicate to which speaker you intend to ask the question. I see there is one question already from Abu Toure. What about on and offline technologies? As you know, in many parts of Africa, energy access and internet connectivity are still challenging. Do this solution take such into account? I guess, Dina, if you would like to come in and answer this question.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thank you, Abu, for raising this issue. I think that's really important. And as I mentioned, digital divide is one of the main challenges. I cannot really explain right off the bat, I mean, unless it would be very generic, because again, each country has its own challenges, and it really depends which natural hazard or disaster you're trying to address, but also what is the digital maturity of the country and organization which is trying to implement. But overall, cell phone towers, they can be a great source of information, even like SMS or tracking, GPS, satellite imagery can be great, or even drone imagery might be a really good source. So there are quite many opportunities, but of course they're still limited in the sense that, of course, the internet connection and electricity would be giving more opportunity for real-time data, which is usually the most needed thing in disaster response. But of course, definitely, once you have more clear problem and geography, I think that's definitely can be explored a bit more. I hope that clarifies. Sorry again for a bit generic answer, but definitely we need more details to give more specific answer. Thank you. Over.
Thank you, Dina. Colleagues, if you have any other questions, please raise your hands now. If there is none, Okay, I see there's another question for Glenn. I'm curious if we can share some of the main challenges that you encountered when implementing unblocked cash. So Glenn, if you encounter any challenges, please share with us here, and we'd love to hear more from you. Over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the question. Thanks, Ewan. Probably the main challenge that we had was in terms of government regulation and policy around using blockchain technology. So in terms of the financial systems and the frameworks across the Pacific, especially, the use, when we were doing this program 21-22, the legislative framework didn't allow for technology, this digital payment technology using blockchain. So we had to get a no compete letter from the Reserve Bank of Vanuatu every time we were putting money in or no objection, sorry, to say that they did not object to us to using it. But we had to also put an equivalent amount in a trust account with a local solicitor. We had to match the blockchain amounts that we were spending and putting on the cards to make sure it was always backed by fiat currency in a local trust account, just to ensure we had money to pay the vendors. That was a fairly big one. The other one we worked out, and it sort of goes a little bit with what Avi was saying, that some areas had that technology issue in terms of lack of digital coverage. But what we did find, and we got around it, is that as soon as people came into coverage, the transactions that they'd done, the vendors, so long as they could get to a cell phone site or somewhere or on the internet, as soon as they got that, then those transactions would update and the payment processing wasn't an issue. And we didn't have any issues once we worked out that was the easiest way to clarify it. Now, if you're in an area where there's just no digital coverage, no cell phone coverage, no internet, then we can't help there. I don't think the solution would be appropriate there. But thankfully, even in a remote geographic location like Vanuatu, people were within 5 or 10 minutes drive or walk from being able to get minimal coverage to allow those mobile phones to work to send that very short packet of data. So those were the two main challenges we had. And afterwards, we actually commenced putting a report together to show how can we embed this digital payment system into the Vanuatu government. And that's something that most central banks are looking at across the Pacific region now, incorporating this type of digital payment methodology used for humanitarian response. Hope that answers it.
Thank you so much, Glenn. I see there is another question. What safeguards measures are put in place to avoid fraud? I guess that's a quite broad question in terms of policy making, but maybe Dina, if you have some answers for that.
So for frauds, usually that's one of the reasons why blockchain technologies are used in the first place. They can really limit the fraud risk, but of course there are always some possibilities. And I think nowadays with the advancement of technologies, that's something that can be really done quite easily, because I think in financial sector, we see that now there are like lots of deepfakes, and that's quite commonly used with the voice recording, face recognition, and others. So I think there are always new challenges coming, and that's why we need to be aware of those and update our solutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Dina. There's also another question on the electronic wallet, as it is one of the cash distribution methodologies through the cash for groups. So yeah, if like Dina or Glenn, if you want to share any insights from this side.
Yeah, I can jump on that one. Yes, mobile wallets we're seeing now through the likes of M-Pasa on the Vodafone networks. So at the moment in Vanuatu, we've just finished a trial with that was run by Red Cross, where they were using those type of mobile wallets. The difference being in using the wallets is that, and I didn't cover it off in my presentation, but a huge advantage of using the card system is that we have to remember that only 37% of people were banked in the Pacific. So there's a huge gap in financial literacy. And some countries like Vanuatu, Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, mobile wallet uptake is actually very, very light. It's not as big as, say, areas like Fiji, where it's massive. It's huge across in Fiji. So in the smaller developing countries, we haven't seen it like we've seen in some African countries where wallets are just, everyone has one. So it saves having to download the wallets. You need to download the app on your phone. You need to do the registration process. With the card, you just got given a card. You got given the card, you got it recorded in a spreadsheet at the beneficiary center, and that was it. So it was very, very simple, which I think got people used to the idea that you could have a payment method in your hand that wasn't fiat currency, that wasn't a piece of paper or a coin. It was really different. And that was a huge thing. People got used to the fact that they could use a card to pay for something. And so that was one of the big benefits that we saw. So it was very, very good. And just, I see that you've got a question there about scalability. Blockchain networks, in terms of humanitarian response, they're running on a different thread than what you'll see in the likes of cryptocurrencies and the like. The blockchain networks and technology we're using with Sempo could handle huge volumes. And certainly for humanitarian response, it was never an issue because it's a targeted response with targeted beneficiaries over a targeted time zone. So, you might be doing a response for a 6-month period to 100 or 200 or 300,000 beneficiaries. So it wasn't really an issue. It's not like the cryptocurrency and the Bitcoin where you're talking about hundreds of millions of transactions every day. So it coped really well. It was, we could have scaled it up to hundreds of thousands if we had that sort of population base.
Thank you, Glenn. I think people are really interested in the blockchain technologies, and there is another related question on the challenges. It says blockchain networks often struggle with scalability and in cash programming, where a high volume of transactions may occur, scalability can become a significant challenge. So did that encountered in your case, Glenn? How did you overcome this challenge?
Hopefully my last answer sort of covered off that about the idea that we could scale it for humanitarian response. The last count we did some looking at this. There's around 25 what we call verified vendors of this type of technology, ones that have proven, have been in theatre and have seen combat, so to speak. Sempo out of Australia was one of those. We went with them because they're on a similar time zone to us, based in Australia. But there's many of them around the world. Their technology and their server platform that they're huge is scalable into the millions and runs really well. But we certainly encourage the whole idea that, and they have the ability to actually integrate into wallets as well, and have an on-ramp, off-ramp for between stable coins as well. So many of them are getting very advanced at what they can do. So we think if it works where we are, it'll work anywhere. Certainly they're proven. They audit for scale, and I think all of the agencies like OCHA and UNDP have a fairly good list of organisations, service providers that can do it, and you can do the testing on.
Thanks, Glenn. I see there is another question in the Q&A. How do you recommend addressing the challenges of internet disconnection and the weakness of internet infrastructure, particularly in regions like Gaza, through the use of technology and the improved internet solutions? Dina, do you want to answer this question?
Sorry, let me just check it. Sorry, I think I don't see it.
It's in the Q&A section. How do you recommend addressing the challenges of internet disconnection and the weakness of internet infrastructure?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. I think it really depends on the needs, because I think more recently we see how the humanitarian aid has been delivered using drones. But as for now, I think it proved to be not as efficient as it was expected originally, and I think it was decided to actually abandon this idea. But I think for these ones, the focus is mainly on humanitarian relief. But also I saw some articles where they used satellite imagery to actually map and visualize the distraction level. So those are one of the things that can be done. But of course, the internet and access is quite a big challenge that cannot be addressed at the moment, I guess. I hope that clarifies.
Thank you, Dina. Gökhan, please come in.
Just I want to also remind that during a disaster, most probably you will be losing all your networked connections. This is electricity, water, internet, whatever. So all these technologies, when we are considering their use in the response time, we need to consider them as working with minimal requirements. And before and after are different contexts, but during the disaster, we also need to consider that we will not have access to many of these networks and the underlying technologies or dependent technologies. So it is about understanding the potential and promise of these technologies in disasters, but we always underline that they are coming with limitations, and we need to be careful where we can use and where we cannot. And this is an important part of the report also. Thank you.
Thank you, Gökhan. Colleagues, apologies as we are approaching the end of the webinar. Thank you again to our speakers for answering these questions and for the great presentation. It was really a pleasure to have you with us. We will make sure that we address your questions and answered after this event, and we will be sharing the recordings and the slides and all the materials with you after this event. Now, before we close the event, I would suggest we all open the cameras for a group photo. So if it's possible, colleagues, please open your cameras and we will take a group photo before we closing the webinar. Thank you, everyone. Dina, will you be able to do a screenshot for us?
Yes, also colleagues taking screenshots.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. I think this concludes today's event. Thank you all for attending. We will be sharing the reporting, the recordings with all of you who registered and joined us today. Thanks, everyone. We wish you a pleasant and a productive remainder of the week. And thank you very much and take care. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks and congratulations.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.